I should be dead. That's not a figure of speech. It's not an exaggeration for attention. It's a simple, cold fact that I've carried with me ever since a Thursday in March a few years ago, when I opened a page I never should have opened, read something I never should have read, and realized that what was written there was about me. The date was right, the method was right, the place was right. And I still don't know how someone knew it before it happened. It all started in a stupid way, like almost everything that changes a person's life does. I was in an online group chat with people who shared an interest in unexplained phenomena. Nothing too serious. The kind of group where someone posts a picture of a strange shadow on a wall, someone else uploads an audio clip with static that could mean absolutely anything, and everyone debates it for hours without getting anywhere. It was entertainment, a pastime, the sort of thing you do at 11 at night when you don't want to sleep yet. But one night, someone dropped a link in the chat with no comment, no explanation, no context, just the link. And right after posting it, they disappeared from the conversation. Not deleted, not kicked out, just silent. As if they had sent it and immediately shut off their computer. I almost didn't click it. And every time I think about that moment, I wonder what my life would be like if I had simply ignored it, if I had closed the app and gone to sleep like any normal person would have done. But I clicked. The page that opened was ugly. No design, no images, no concern for appearance whatsoever. White text on a black background. Plain serifless font, too small to read comfortably. It looked like something built in the earliest days of the internet and never updated. The kind of website that makes a modern browser feel out of place, like you accidentally traveled back in time to access it. There was a list. Long. Untitled. No explanation header. Every entry followed the same format, a date, a short description, and an alphanumeric code at the end that I didn't understand at first. I scrolled through the page for a few minutes without fully understanding what I was looking at. The dates were mixed, some from weeks ago, some from months ago, some still in the future. The descriptions were vague, yet oddly specific at the same time in a way that bothered me before I even understood why. Male, 34 years old, accident on wet highway, alone in vehicle. Female, 28 years old, cardiac arrest, third floor apartment. Male, 41 years old, drowning, non-intentional. My first thought was ARG, alternate reality game, that kind of online fiction presented as real, where you never quite know where the fiction ends. I assumed that was what it was. I took a screenshot out of curiosity, closed the tab, and went to sleep. But something stayed with me, an itch in the back of my mind that wouldn't leave me alone. The next morning, without planning to, almost without realizing what I was doing, I opened the screenshot and searched a few of the dates and descriptions I had seen. I picked 3 of the older ones, the ones far enough in the past to be easier to verify. 2 of them I found matching news reports. Not perfectly, not names and addresses, but enough to make my stomach turn. Gender, age range, circumstances of death, time frame. A coincidence? Possible, but the kind you feel in your chest before you can rationalize it away. I knew I could be exaggerating the similarities and ignoring the differences. That's what the human brain does when it wants to believe something. I reminded myself of that deliberately, forced myself to think rationally, tried to move on with my day. Then, later that same afternoon, almost by accident while searching for another tab I had left open, I returned to the link. And I saw my own name. Not my full name, just my first name. But everything that came after that slowly pulled the ground out from under me as I read line by line, carefully, as if some part of me already knew it needed time to absorb each detail before moving to the next. My exact age. A specific physical trait, not an especially common one, that I rarely mention to anyone. The city where I lived, and a date. A date that was 11 days away. The cause was described in 4 words. I'm not going to repeat them. Not because I think it changes anything for the person listening, but because every time I try to say those 4 words out loud, they get stuck somewhere in my throat. It's the only part of all this that I still can't say naturally. What I can say is that they were plausible words, not absurd, not impossible, the kind of thing that happens to ordinary people in ordinary situations that suddenly go wrong. The kind of thing I could easily imagine happening to me. I stared at the screen for a length of time I still can't measure. You know those moments when time does something strange and you can't tell whether a minute or 20 minutes passed? It was like that. When my mind finally started functioning again, my first reaction was to dismantle the whole thing systematically, as coldly and rationally as I could manage. I took each element of the description and searched for another explanation. Common first name? Sure, plenty of people have it. Could be coincidence. Exact age? Less common, but in a long enough list, probabilities can hit exact numbers. The physical trait? That's where I froze. Because it wasn't generic. It wasn't something most people would notice about me walking down the street. It was something even I rarely thought about, and yet there it was, described with a precision that probability alone couldn't explain. The city? Specific. Not some massive metropolis where half the country lives. Specific enough to feel wrong. I spent hours trying to figure out where I might have posted those details publicly. I checked every profile, every forum account, every comment I had made over the years. I searched for any mention of that specific physical characteristic on any platform I had ever used. I found nothing that explained it. And then I did the stupidest thing I possibly could have done.
I went back to the forum, but this time, instead of just looking at the list, I started exploring. There was more than the list, much more. There were sections I hadn't seen before because I'd closed the page too quickly the first time. One of them was a comment system attached to every entry. Comments from users with no names, no profile pictures, no verifiable identities whatsoever. There was no way to tell how many different people were there. It could have been hundreds. It could have been a dozen people using multiple accounts. But what disturbed me was something very specific. No one questioned whether any of it was real. No one debated whether the entries were fiction or truth. People discussed them the same way others discuss weather forecasts. This one's already confirmed, found the news article. Does anyone have additional context on last week's case? The description was unusual. The error margin this cycle is slightly above historical average. They had their own terminology, established discussion patterns, a level of familiarity that only comes from spending years in the same place. There was also an archive section, older entries organized by period, tagged as confirmed, unconfirmed, or what they called resolved differently. That last category was the smallest, and it was the one I interested me most. I created an empty account with no information attached to it and started reading through older threads, trying to build some kind of understanding of how the place worked. What I pieced together over hours of reading was this. The forum had existed for more than 10 years. No one knew who created it. There were old references to someone asking about its origin, and a moderator had answered with a single sentence. That isn't relevant. There was an administrator account that appeared in logs but never posted, never interacted, never explained anything. It only removed content that violated rules no one had written down, yet everyone seemed to understand instinctively. The entries themselves were never submitted by users. They simply appeared. No visible author, no editable timestamps, no trace of who created the content. One moment an entry wasn't there, the next moment it was. Some users claimed they had tried monitoring the exact times new entries appeared and never found a pattern. There was no fixed schedule, no regular frequency, nothing that suggested a human process behind it. And according to the oldest users, the accuracy rate was approximately 92%.
I read that number again and again, trying to find some context that would make it feel less heavy. I couldn't. One user in particular stood out in the archives. They had been posting for years with almost obsessive consistency, documenting every entry, every confirmation, every discrepancy. They maintained their own spreadsheet and shared updates with the forum periodically. Their number was 91.8% accuracy, calculated across more than 400 entries over 6 years. More than 400 entries in 6 years. I had to stop reading for a moment just to let that number settle in my head. I went to that user's profile and sent them a message. I didn't expect an answer. The account looked active, but there was no way to know whether the person still logged in. Less than 10 minutes later, I got a reply. Short, direct. I saw that you found your entry. Don't panic. Breathe. Tell me exactly what it says. We talked for hours. He, and I'll use he simply because I have nothing better to call him since I never learned anything real about this person, since he had gone through the same thing years earlier. He had found the forum by accident, seen his own entry, and survived the date attached to it. But he explained something important. He hadn't survived by simply avoiding an obvious place or situation. It was more complicated than that. And that complication was exactly what I needed to understand. He said the entries rarely describe something directly avoidable. They describe convergence points, moments where a very specific chain of factors intersects into a result. And changing one factor superficially doesn't necessarily dissolve the convergence point. Sometimes it only shifts it, changes the shape without changing the outcome. He told me that he had once tried locking himself inside his house on the day tied to his own entry. No car, no travel, no obvious danger. And he had nearly died inside the house from something completely different than what the entry described, but in a way that, from a certain angle, could still have matched the original wording. What worked for him, and he repeated several times that he had no guarantee it would work for me, was something else entirely. Not avoiding the day, understanding the day. Breaking the entry apart piece by piece, understanding what mechanically needed to happen for that description to become reality, and then working on each part of that mechanism independently. We spent hours doing exactly that with my entry, piece by piece. He asked questions, I answered them, and slowly a map began to form. Not a map of how to protect myself from one specific thing, but a map of how I moved through the world automatically. My routines, my habits, the moments where I operated on autopilot and therefore became vulnerable to a sequence of events I would never consciously choose, but could still walk into without noticing. And then he said the sentence that stayed with me. The forum doesn't create what's going to happen, it records it. And sometimes recording something is what gives a person the chance to change it. Not always, but sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. I held onto that with both hands. For the next 11 days, I lived with a level of awareness I had never experienced before and hope I never have to experience again. It wasn't paranoia. I learned quickly that paranoia and awareness are opposites, not synonyms. Paranoia is noise. It's seeing danger everywhere without hierarchy, without focus, without usefulness. What I developed during those 11 days was the opposite. Silence. Clarity. Every small decision became visible before I made it. Every choice that normally would have happened automatically passed through a conscious filter first. Every morning I woke up and spent a few minutes thinking about the map we had built, the patterns, the mechanisms, the points where the sequence would need to align for the entry to come true, and I started changing variables, quietly, without drama. Sometimes it was taking a different route. Sometimes it was changing the time I left somewhere. Sometimes it was simply saying no to something I normally would have accepted without thinking. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? What would that conversation even sound like?
I found a forum that predicts deaths, and there's an entry with my name scheduled for 11 days from now. That's not the kind of sentence that ends well for the person saying it. So I carried it alone, and the days passed with that strange slowness that only happens when you're watching time too closely. Day 1, Day 2, Day 5, Day 8. The 11th day arrived on a Friday. Normal morning, overcast sky, the kind of day that doesn't seem like anything. I had planned to stay home. Simple plan. No drama, no symbolic meaning. Just stay inside, work remotely, and avoid creating any of the circumstances the map suggested were necessary. But early in the afternoon, something came up.
One of those situations that feels completely mundane. A message from someone asking me for a simple favor that required me to go out for a little while. A reasonable explanation, no obvious warning signs. The kind of thing that, on any other day, I would have agreed to without even fully processing the request. But I was paying attention. And while I was reading the message, while my brain was already forming the automatic response to say yes, I saw it. I saw the sequence, not all at once, but cascading into place. If I left now, at this time, taking the route that would feel most natural, I would end up in a specific place around a specific hour, and that exact intersection of place and time was the convergence point the map had warned me about. It wasn't certainty. It never was certainty, but it was too close. I said no. Short excuse, no drama. The person understood. The conversation ended. Life moved on. I stayed home. Nothing happened to me that day. I cooked, watched something, tried not to think. Didn't completely succeed, but I tried. The next morning, with hands slightly trembling in a way I hadn't expected, I opened the forum. My entry was gone. It wasn't marked under any category. It wasn't archived. It wasn't anywhere I could find. It simply no longer existed, as if it had never been there at all, as if the list had forgotten me. I stared at the screen for a very long time. The feeling that came wasn't euphoria. It wasn't explosive relief. It was something quieter and heavier than I expected. It felt like walking through a door most people don't even know exists, seeing what's on the other side, and somehow making it back, but without being able to close the door behind you. Because you can't. There's no way to. I kept visiting the forum for a few months after that. Not every day, but regularly. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because I could no longer pretend I didn't know that place existed. Maybe because some part of me felt a vague responsibility I didn't know how to fulfill, but couldn't ignore either.
I tried warning people twice. The first time, I found an entry detailed enough to make me think I knew who it was about. Not with certainty, there was never certainty, but with a probability too high to ignore. Someone I knew casually. I tried approaching them in a way that wouldn't sound completely insane. I said that I had come across concerning information from a source I couldn't properly explain, that maybe it would be smart to be careful on a specific date. They looked at me the way people look at someone who is obviously going through something strange, thanked me politely in the way people do when they want to end a conversation, and change the subject. I didn't push it. The second time never even became an attempt. The entry disappeared 2 days before the date without me saying anything to anyone, and I never found out whether that person had discovered the forum on their own, whether they had done something differently, whether the system had simply been wrong that time. I never found out, and not knowing is the heaviest part of all of this. You can't build certainty around any of it, not about how the forum works, not about where the entries come from, not about who or what is behind it. You're left with fragments, with an accuracy rate terrifying enough to matter, but imperfect enough to keep doubt alive. with the memory of 11 days that permanently changed the way I experience being alive. I stopped visiting the forum a long time ago. Not because I found answers, but because I realized continuing to visit it was a way of refusing to move on. It meant standing forever at the edge of something I cannot understand, and maybe was never meant to be understood. Some things you learn to carry without comprehension. This was one of them. I deleted the link. I don't know if the forum still exists. I never checked. And if you're thinking about trying to find it, I understand the curiosity. I would have the same one. But think about this. If it exists and you find your entry there, what are you going to do? Are you ready to live with that? Because I wasn't. But some things stayed with me in ways I never chose and no longer want to undo. I pay attention differently now. To patterns, to sequences, to those moments where life is carrying you somewhere without you consciously deciding to go there. That isn't paranoia. It's the opposite. It's presence. It's the difference between moving through life on autopilot and truly inhabiting every small choice you make.
Strangely, that experience made me calmer in situations of pressure. Because I already know what it feels like to look at something that seems inevitable and have to decide whether you're going to accept it or search for the variable that might still change it. And there's something the user who helped me said at the end of our last conversation that comes back to me far more often than I ever expected. He said that his theory, just a theory with no verifiable basis, was that the forum doesn't record everything, that there's a limit to how many entries appear in any given period of time, far smaller than you'd expect considering the size of the world. And his theory was that only the cases where seeing the information could actually make a difference appear there. Cases where the person has a real chance to change something. That maybe the act of seeing is part of the mechanism. I don't know if I believe that. I don't know if it's true or if it's just a story he told himself so he could sleep at night. I don't know if I'm not doing the exact same thing right now, building a narrative that makes the experience bearable instead of simply terrifying. But if it is true, then it means something I try not to think about for too long. It means that the entries that don't disappear before the date, most of them, that 92%, either belong to people who never found the forum, or people who did find it and it still wasn't enough. And I wonder, on the nights when that thought appears without invitation, what separates those two groups? What I did differently? Whether it was the map we built, whether it was the choice I made that Friday afternoon, whether it was luck, or whether it was something I'll never be able to name. I should be dead, and I'm not. And that, no matter how much I try to turn it into relief, still hasn't fully become relief. It's something more complicated, heavier, the kind of thing you carry not as a burden, but as an awareness that never fully shuts off. Every Thursday in March, I wake up earlier than usual. I don't plan it, it just happens. And I lie there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, feeling the specific weight of that day before I get up and move on. Like anyone would.